Welcome to the 6th Annual Morristown Festival of Books, hosted by our official sponsor, Morgan Stanley Private Wealth Management. We're truly honored and grateful for their support. Let's give them a hand. And as well, please thank our generous presenting sponsors, Lori Siegel and Joel Osowski, Wendy and Greg Supran, Community Foundation of New Jersey, and the Mayo Performing Arts Center. This historic venue is graciously sponsored by Kim and Finn Wentworth and J.P. Morgan Chase. And our festival could not exist without the commitment of all our donors and incredible red-shirted volunteers. Of my proud to be one. Please applaud for volunteers. We take suggestions seriously, so please fill out the comment cards at your seat and deposit them along with any donations into the red buckets you see at the door and throughout the festival. After this session, please meet the author across the street at Vale Mansion Lawn, where you can purchase books and have them signed. Books are also available in the front lobby. Our authors have generously donated their time to be here. The best way to thank them is by buying their books. Please turn off your cell phone. Flash photography and recording devices are prohibited, but regular cell phone you can do. Along with our author sponsors, we're delighted to present Michael Kranish, who will be introduced in a moment by Jesse Epstein. Kranish's talk on American cycling hero Major Taylor is dedicated to the late Marty Epstein, Jesse's father, longtime owner of Marty's Reliable Cycle in Morristown, and founder of the Garden State Fondo, formerly known as the Grand Fondo, New Jersey. Marty touched many people's lives and worked tirelessly to help make Morristown a thriving, close-knit, bike-friendly community. The Morristown Festival of Books is honored to welcome Michael Kranish and is equally honored to dedicate his talk to the legendary community and cycling advocate, Marty Epstein. Jesse will say a few words here, and then we'll introduce our author. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be carrying on my father's legacy of community involvement through the sport of cycling in Morristown. I am a fourth-generation business person in this town, and I'm very proud of the amazing changes happening here each and every day. Events like this are paramount in helping to raise awareness about the sport of cycling so that we can continue to build a better cycling infrastructure in town. My father always enjoyed learning about cycling history and was proud that New Jersey has such deep and strong roots in the sport of cycling. My father opened Marty's Reliable Cycle in 1978. I was 8 months old. He always had a vision for Morristown to be the cycling capital of the East Coast. During the 1990s, my dad and his lifelong friend Jeff Broman traveled all around the eastern part of New Jersey interviewing famous track racers and their relatives from the 1920s. Did you know that bicycle racing during the 1920s here in New Jersey was a huge part of our culture? Most people don't. Can you imagine that some of the stars of the sport made a significantly larger salary than the likes of Babe Ruth? In places like Newark, Nutley, Coney Island, and Madison Square Garden, they would build large wooden tracks, and the cyclists would compete in endurance events, sometimes lasting for up to 6 days. I'm very excited to have Michael Kranish here in Morristown. Marty's Reliable Cycle, in cooperation with the Major Taylor Cycling Club, has made an entire event out of the day. Michael Kranish is an investigative political reporter for the Washington Post. Today, he'll be talking about his latest book, The World's Fastest Man, The Extraordinary Life of Cyclist Major Taylor, America's first black sports hero. Kranish's long-standing interest in Major Taylor's life first led to a 2001 cover story in the Boston Globe's Sunday magazine, and it's easy to understand why he pursued the story of Taylor as the first American-born black world champion in any sport, a dozen years before Jack Johnson won the boxing title and 50 years before Jackie Robinson became a Major League Baseball player. Taylor's accomplishment shattered racist perceptions and had widespread impact across sport and society. Taylor's extraordinary life at the intersection of the Jim Crow era and the Gilded Age provided an unparalleled chance to explore one of the great turning points in American history. Please give a warm Morristown welcome to Michael Kranish.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming to honor your father and all that your family's done for cycling in Morristown and New Jersey. It's such a great pleasure to be here. I want to put you in the year of 1896, and the Supreme Court has just ruled in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson 7-1 that separate but equal accommodations were acceptable under the Constitution. Basically, that institutionalized racism further in this country and led to the heightening of the Jim Crow era. So in 1896, if you can imagine the world as it was then, there were perhaps 300 automobiles in the country. They were experiments that were built by bicycle manufacturers, basically. They had no brakes, they go backwards. The fastest machine, basically, on the planet was a locomotive. But the fastest after that were the bicycles that were raced by these great athletes that participated in races all over the country. So this was a time when bicycling really was king. The most popular sport in the country was cycling, more so than baseball, more so than boxing. You would have these wonderful places called velodromes, cathedrals of cycling, and they would attract 10,000, 15,000 people. The athletes who raced there, the best ones in the world, would earn in $1896 $10,000 a year. So that was an extraordinary amount of money, and they were some of the wealthiest people who weren't in business, around. So they were superstars before that phrase was even known. But it was mostly a white man's world, as it was in so many phases of society. 7 months after the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the greatest sporting event of the day was to be held in the greatest arena of the time at Madison Square Garden. And that's the iteration that's at the current Madison Square Park, if you're familiar with that. And this was a wonderful building designed by Stanford White. And from all around the world, the best racers would come because this was the 6-day race. This was a race in which you would go around the track for 6 straight days, take a rest here and there. Whoever had the most miles at the end of 6 days was the winner. It was an inhumane contest, but incredibly exciting. People came from all over to watch this race. There was a young man named Marshall Taylor, who became known as Major, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. And he was a black man who had lived in Indianapolis and then Massachusetts. And he was 18 years old at this time in 1896. And he had a mentor who ran a bicycle manufacturing company, and that man's name was Bertie Munger. And Major Taylor had raced in amateur races for a year or two under Munger's tutelage. Munger had this crazy idea that the first great professional race that Marshall Taylor could compete in would be the 6-day race at Madison Square Garden. It made absolutely no sense. Major Taylor had basically done sprinting. The most he raced that I know was 75, maybe 100 miles. There was nothing really to compare to the 6-day race. But Bertie Munger was a great civil rights thinker of his time, and he thought that it was important to put Major Taylor forefront right away in the most publicized event of the time in sports. So incredibly, he pushed Major Taylor to consider entering this. So Major Taylor went to the promoters of this race. They happened to be baseball promoters, bicycle promoters, whatever was the great sport of the day, he went in to see these two gentlemen at their office by Madison Square Garden and asked for a license to compete in this race, which was all white men. And one of the promoters said, if we allow you to race in this race, there'll be riots in the street of New York City. And the other promoter said, shouldn't you be shining the white gentleman's shoes on Fifth Avenue? And Major Taylor made his best argument. He said, if you allow me to compete, you'll be able to advertise this race as the great contest between black and whites. And you'll draw even more interest. And even at this time, the promoters were looking for ways to draw in more people to the event. So they had an epiphany, and they said, okay, because they figured this will just prove the racist theories more. There's no way Major Taylor's going to stay in this race for more than a day or two. He'll drop out, and in the meantime, he'll attract attention. So they gave him a license, and they allowed him to come and compete in this great 6-day race. So again, it's the time of Plessy versus Ferguson. It's a time when blacks simply weren't competing in all phases of society, and Major Taylor was put on the same stage, essentially equal to start with all the great racers of the day. If you could picture Madison Square Garden at this time, it's filled with smoke, it's filled with grime, the soot from the grills that are making the meals for all the spectators. There's 10 to 15,000 people, but you can barely see because there's so much smoke from tobacco and so forth. In fact, Major Taylor later said when he was racing in this venue that there was so much grime accumulated on his fellow racers that they could have passed for his brother. So he might have been a little bit hyperbole in that, but it gives you a sense of the extraordinary circumstances, not just to see around the curvature of the oval, but to breathe in that awful air in that circumstance. So in December of 1896, Bertie Munger takes Major Taylor to Madison Square Garden to compete in this race. Before the 6-day race is held, there's a preliminary match. And you have to realize this is the time of great newspaper wars. There's no radio, television, film, really. It's promoted, however, in the newspapers of the day. And if you look back, you'll see the incredible coverage this began to get with Major Taylor participating in this race. So before the 6-day race, there's a preliminary match that is a half-mile sprint. And the best sprinters in the world are allowed to compete in that race. So Major Taylor first enters that contest. The best sprinter in America was a man named Eddie Ball. He was one of those who was earning $10,000 or more a year. He was the great star of the day. Eddie Ball, they called him Cannonball Ball, because he could shoot like a ball from a cannon and take over whoever was ahead of him in a race. So Cannonball Ball lined up against Major Taylor and several other racers from around the world in this sprinting contest. As the starting pistol went off, there were a lot of supporters of Major Taylor. He had trained with the South Brooklyn Wheelmen and felt confident that he could race in this kind of contest. So the starting gun goes off, and Major Taylor goes around one time and 2 times and several times around the lap. And as he comes to the finishing lap, he is ahead. And so he throws up his arms in victory, but the South Brooklyn Wheelmen are saying, no, there's one more lap to go. This was all new to Major Taylor, and it's so dark and so difficult to see what you're doing and to hear. He finally realizes as Eddie Ball gains on him that there's one more lap to go, and he gives it all of his last effort. And incredibly, he wins the sprint. He wins this contest in his first professional match against the very greatest sprinters in the world. It creates a sensation. So all of the press is writing about this young man who really had just, come on the scene unknown, that this young black man had come on and beaten the best sprinters. In this one brief contest, he disproved all of the racist theories that had been used against him. So it was a great moment, and what I write about in this book is not just a sports story, but I spend a lot of effort trying to weave in the social history, the racial history, so you get a sense of what this accomplishment meant to society at the time. So next what's to happen is the 6-day race, and that is an even incredible contest to remember, to even envision. And when Major Taylor lines up for that contest later, he's surprised that Eddie Ball is not next to him. Eddie Ball is holding the starter's pistol. Eddie Ball, like Major Taylor, is a sprinter. Neither of them had any reason to compete in the 6-day race. It wasn't their specialty, but Major Taylor, to get his license, had agreed to do this. So he went ahead in the contest, and Eddie Ball was the one who set off the starter's pistol. How did Major Taylor come to this point? Well, let me reel it back a little bit and tell you a little bit about how Major Taylor came to this incredible point in his history. Major Taylor was born in Indianapolis. His father, Gilbert Taylor, as I found out in my research, they were from Kentucky, and his father Gilbert had served in the Civil War for the North. The North at a certain point needed black soldiers, and he volunteered, and incredibly he was at the fall of Richmond. So he saw the incredible death and destruction, and his unit was actually given charge of overseeing Confederate prisoners. So he knew well all that had been sacrificed in the name of ending slavery. So Gilbert Taylor's family moved from Kentucky to Indianapolis. That's where Marshall Taylor was born. Marshall Taylor came to know a family called the Southards because his father had worked for the Southard family. And the Southards were very wealthy people in the railroad business. And the Southards had a young boy, and that boy rode a bicycle, and Major Taylor got to know him. And the family gave Major Taylor a bicycle so he could become a playmate of their son. And Major Taylor later said it was like growing up to be a millionaire's son. He would spend days, sometimes nights, with his family, and was able to learn how to ride a bicycle, went to work at a local bicycle store, and the local bicycle store was so impressed with Major Taylor's ability to do these stunts that they put him outside to do stunts to attract customers in. And at some point, Major Taylor was given a military jacket. It's quite possible this was the military jacket his father wore when fighting for the North in the Civil War. I don't know, but it certainly makes a nice part of the story, if that's so. Eventually, there was a gentleman in town who I alluded to previously, Louis DeFranklin Bertie Munger. He had been the fastest man in the world himself in the era of the high-wheel bicycles. He won countless races all over the country, and he had then got into the bicycle manufacturing business, which was booming at this time. He came to hear about Major Taylor, who was performing his stunts just blocks away from Bertie Munger's bicycle manufacturing company. And he took a liking to him. He took him under his wing, appropriately for the nickname of Bertie. And he started watching Major Taylor perform around a local track. And he soon realized that Major Taylor was one of the fastest bicycle riders he had ever seen for that age. And certainly Bertie Munger had seen the fastest riders in the world. So he gave Major Taylor a state-of-the-art bicycle and started teaching him all the tricks of the trade, as it were. And Major Taylor tried to learn more techniques. He went to the local YMCA one day because he wanted to build up his strength. He was sort of a scrawny kid. He would reach about 150 in typical racing weight, and he was 5'7" at his tallest. So he went to the YMCA one day, like the other racers did, and he walked up the steps, and there was a person there that said, "I'm sorry, you can't enter." "Why not?" "Well, because your skin is black." Major Taylor said this was the first time in his life that he encountered what he called the monster prejudice, quote unquote. And he was very upset. He went to tell Bertie Munger what had happened. And meanwhile, Bertie Munger's partners in the bicycle business were also upset that Bertie Munger had become so close to Major Taylor, a black person. And they said, if you continue your association with him, we don't want you in the business anymore. So together, incredibly, Bertie Munger said, you know what, I'm going to leave Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm going to leave Indianapolis and move to Worcester, Massachusetts, where I'm told there's a more lenient attitude towards blacks. And he asked Major Taylor to come with him. He said, if you do, I'll give you a job at the factory, I'll train you some more, I'll make sure you have the best bikes available in the country for racing. And Major Taylor went to his parents, got permission, and moved to Worcester, Massachusetts with Bertie Munger. And that's how they came to be together in Massachusetts. To give you a sense of how incredibly popular bicycle racing was at the time, if you look at the Worcester, Massachusetts newspaper from that era, there's a race in which Major Taylor participated in. 50,000 people came to that race. This is a city, a smaller city west of Boston. This isn't New York City, this is Worcester, Mass. So it was an extraordinary thing for Major Taylor to participate in these races. And that's how he came to go to Madison Square Garden, find himself winning the sprint, and then competing in the 6-day race. So as the 6-day race began, the crowd was incredibly interested in the idea of black versus white, as Major Taylor had predicted. After a day, however, Major Taylor was so incredibly tired, he asked for rest. Bertie Munger was there and said, you just had your rest, you need to keep on going. It was pretty tough on Major Taylor, and by the second day, Major Taylor was hallucinating. And he said to a reporter at the time, overheard by a reporter at the time, that there's a person racing me around the track with a knife in his hands, and he's coming after me and wants to kill me. Because he was just so incredibly tired from this racing. But he stuck with it. He felt, and you can see, because he wrote a letter to a magazine before this race, which he signed, Major Taylor, Colored Cyclist, where he talks about the importance of showing what he was doing was for his race. It wasn't just to be an athlete who won great prizes and championships. He saw himself fighting for a greater social purpose. So he did everything he could to stay, and he felt if he dropped out, that would send exactly the wrong signal of what he wanted to do. So he managed to stay in this race. There's another point at which he told Bertie Munger, our trainer, you know, I just can't go on. They gave him what they call a special concoction. If you drink this concoction, you'll be able to go for the next 18 hours. Well, it was just bicarbonate of soda, but nonetheless, he managed to go on. He said at another point, you know, I need food, I have to eat. And he had just eaten a great dinner, but he was just so incredibly hungry and tired. Somehow, during this race, many of the great riders of the day did drop out. It was just too difficult to compete. And day after day, the newspapers, the newspaper wars would write, you can see in those newspapers, illustrations of Major Taylor and what he had to go through. But Major Taylor managed to go the entire 6 days. And at the end of 6 days, he didn't win. No one expected him to win, but he came in with 6th or 7th place. He'd gone about 1,700 miles, I know this from memory, 1,700 miles, which is only a little bit less than what you do in the Tour de France over 6 days, over 3 weeks. So it was an incredible thing for him to go the 1,700 miles in the 6-day race in Madison Square Garden. So I mentioned that after the sprint victory became a sensation, after surviving for 6 days in this great contest, he was written about all over the world. And in the book I say that he was one of the most chronicled African-American individuals of his day. Thousands and thousands of stories were written about him in the American press, and then later when he competed in Europe and Australia. So many stories which were a great benefit to me as a writer talking about this. I'm going to get a signal when I have to stop talking, but I want to show you.
Yeah, I was going to do that in 2 minutes.
Sorry?
I was going to give you the signal in 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, I'm going to show you a few quick slides, if I can. Let's see. I need to come up and see what I'm seeing. I might lose the mic, though. That's Major Taylor when he was about 15 years old, very scrawny kid. It's hard to imagine this was the man who would win all these great victories, but that's what he looked like when he was a kid. Sorry, I'm going to move out here a little bit. Can you still hear me? That's a picture of Bertie Munger, who I mentioned, the trainer. This is Arthur Zimmerman, who wrote a book on training that was very important to Major Taylor. He studied the training and nutrition techniques that his friend Arthur Zimmerman put forward in this book called Points on Training. And as a result of that, Major Taylor became one of the fittest athletes of the day. This was Madison Square Garden that he competed in. That's Eddie Cannonball Bald. This was one of the first integrated sports teams in American history, and that's Major Taylor competing in Boston with an integrated cycling team. This is how he was caricatured time and time again. Very racist drawings that would appear. I mentioned he would write to magazines defending himself in his race, and in return, he would constantly be caricatured, belittled, the worst things you can imagine. That's another professional photo of Major Taylor, and that's what he looked like after several years of incredible technique, of nutrition and training. I write in the book all the techniques that he used, way ahead of his time. He ate prodigious amounts of eggs to get more protein, and in the back of the book I actually have an appendix of his training methods, because I just thought it was so interesting what he did to go from that scrawny kid you saw to what he looked like just a few years later to become the fastest man in the world. He put this picture of himself in his autobiography, wearing just his shorts, and he said, "This is what I need to look like in perfect, quote-unquote, condition and form." He felt if he was an ounce over or underweight, that he wouldn't be at his best. He needed to be in absolute perfect condition, and that's what he did. I'm doing this very quick so I can get to the questions. This is a button that says black versus white. I mentioned they promote these races as black versus white. Here's an example of it. That's his family. That's his wife, Daisy, and his daughter, Sydney, who I had a chance to interview in 2001 when she was 96 years old, when I wrote a magazine story about Major Taylor for the Boston Globe. So I had a chance to meet many members of the Major Taylor family. But meeting his daughter was a great inspiration. And probably, if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. That's a picture of him when he competed in France. He was on the cover. I'll get to that. I would normally talk about that, but we need to move on. He competed, and he was featured in newspapers, magazines all over the world, particularly in France. He became an incredible celebrity. And he was constantly featured in the magazines and newspapers of the day. I'll skip over this. I just want to leave you with this, and I'll read it. You can read it yourself, but it said, Taylor paved the way for the pantheon of athletes who transcended their role to fight for civil rights. At a time of great inequality, Taylor said he should be remembered for fighting for, quote, simple justice, equal rights, and a square deal for the posterity of my downtrodden but brave people, not only in athletic games and sports, but in every honorable game of human endeavor. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
At the microphone in front of the room, but I see no microphone.
I'm going to bring a microphone around. If you would like to take a stand, would like to ask questions.
Perfect. And if I may ask the first question, was he called Major because of the military jacket?
Maybe you need the mic. I think
The question was he called Major because of the military jacket? I believe he was. He certainly was wearing a military jacket. That's totally agreed upon. The only question is, was it a jacket that someone simply provided him, like was it a livery coat type thing, or was it a jacket that his father had worn when Gilbert Taylor fought in the Civil War for the North? That I don't know, but as I mentioned, I kind of like that story.
So. Raise your hand, Tracy, will come with the mic.
Hi. There you go.
Good morning. I was just curious where you got the inspiration for the story.
I was working for the Boston Globe, and at some point I heard about the story of Major Taylor, who had lived in Worcester, Mass. And I'm a cyclist. But I was really interested in the social history. Basically, it boiled down to I heard about this individual, Major Taylor, who I had not heard about that time, so we're going back 18 years ago. How did this individual at the height of the Jim Crow era manage to become a world champion and overcome all the incredible racist Jim Crow things going on at the time? It was really boiled down to that sentence, and I was interested in doing a book at the time that might look at social history. So I'm not a cycling geek, I'm a cyclist, but I don't intend to write another book about cycling. I've written several books, but it really was my interest in the social history and trying to understand how did this young black man at the most difficult time overcome this incredible racism to do what he did, what message did that send. And when I do a book like this, it's sort of like a window into our country's history. And so the narrative of Major Taylor winning these races, becoming a world champion, which I didn't get into in the talk, but as my publisher would say, it's in the book. That in itself is an incredible narrative, engine that drives the story. All the difficulties he faced, all the racism he faced, being beaten up, being almost left for dead in a track at one point, all the things he went through, overcoming all that. So I just thought his story was incredible, but also really a window into our history, and I just kept getting interested. I did the magazine story, and I did several other books, and then I just kept thinking, well, one day I might do a book about Major Taylor, and at some point, I did a little more, and then finally did the book. So it's not the world's fastest book.
I just want to say thank you for, writing. Oh, okay. Thank you for writing the book and making the general population aware of his great effort and diligence in overachieving. As a man of color and in this day of age of what's going on, etc., the psychological, I feel like some of that stuff is still going on. And even today we have great black cyclists who have to go through the same, we don't know if you're good enough, overall about what he dealt with, but in
Yeah.
terms of psychological, when you spoke to his daughter, what was it like for him to come home and to say, Daddy, how was your day?
Great question. And thank you for coming out. At every talk I've done, I would say I've had members of the local Major Taylor Cycling Club come, often in their kits, like these folks here today. It's really great. And if you're not aware of it, all over the country there's Major Taylor cycling clubs. They're just wonderful folks and very supportive of what I've tried to do. And I know the family, the Taylor family, is equally appreciative and is in touch with many of the clubs. So I'll tell you an anecdote that I think helps understand what he went through. There was a period of time when many of the white racers began to fear Major Taylor because he so often beat them. It was embarrassing to them, and he was also collecting a lot of winnings that they thought that they should be earning, and they would try to say under Jim Crow laws you can't compete. They tried to get the bicycle organizations to ban him, and oftentimes they were successful in banning him. It became so bad that at one point, Bertie Munger, his manager, convinced Major Taylor to sit for the application of a lotion that was advertised as lightening your skin so much you could pass for a white. This was a very racist product advertised in a lot of places. There was a lot of pressure on blacks to use this. And so incredibly, Bertie Munger applied this lotion to Major Taylor day after day. It was poisonous to the extreme. It was incredibly bitter application, very painful. And I found records, and I've described in the book, where Major Taylor says, I thought I was going to die because it was so painful. After several days, while his skin lightened a little bit, Bertie Munger realized this was not going to be a good idea, and they agreed to stop the process. And after that, Major Taylor said, never again will I try to let someone make me into something that I am not. I will use the racism against me as my motivation. And that's what he did, and I think that was a turning point for Major Taylor. Nonetheless, it was incredibly difficult for him after he raced for a number of seasons and endured so much physically, psychically. He didn't wear a helmet. He had some serious concussions. You can only imagine what he was going through. If you read his autobiography, he writes about a 3-year period when he says, I had suffered almost from a nervous breakdown. After that, he then disappears for 3 years, so I think he probably did. For him to even say that is extraordinary. Eventually, his wife said, you were born to race, you need to get back out there. He'd become overweight, he trained himself, he got himself back in shape and managed to get back into the circuit in Europe. But you can only imagine the psychic abrasions that he suffered as well as the physical ones. Extraordinarily difficult, but he did manage to overcome those time and time again. I think there's a question down here.
Good morning. Thank you for writing such a seminal book on a topic I think that doesn't get enough attention. The question that I have is that from the time that he came to national attention and the time that he left, I guess he was in Indianapolis. How old was he when he took that trip? Because I'm curious to know, what part of his formative state he was in. Because I guess he was relatively young when he was...
Yeah, I'm thinking he was about, it's in the book, but I think he was about 15 or so, 14 or 15 when I went from Indianapolis to Worcester. He was there for a year or so. And by the time of December 1896 of the race, he was 18. Wow. So very young. And then he went on to win the World Championship in 1899. So 21 or so. Very young to do this. And he had to learn through different methods than all the other racers coming up. But yeah, it wasn't just, he was overcoming so many difficulties at the extreme. But he did, as he said, he felt he was treated in incredibly racist ways, and he was certainly bitter about that. But he also stressed that, he was fortunate. He had people who were supportive of him, blacks and whites, that were crucial at some point. But in the end, it wasn't a matter of a savior. He was alone on a track. It was all up to him. In the end. He didn't work with, there was oftentimes this pattern at the time of racers colluding, if you will, with each other, and they would work together to make sure that someone else didn't win, and that they would basically work maybe in threes, and so that one of that group would win. Major Taylor was never basically able to do that, and if someone offered him, he would say no, that he wanted to do it on his own, and that's really the way he felt.
Did Major Taylor end up being an inspiration to other black athletes at the time? Could you tell us a little bit about
Sure.
that?
So let me tell you an anecdote that I came across in my research. As was mentioned, you know, and I call him in one of the subtitles, America's first black sports hero. This is the first African-American world champion who really got noticed in this way. And it was a dozen years before Jack Johnson became a heavyweight boxing champion. He's better known probably, long before Jesse Owens in the Olympics in the 30s and a half century before Jackie Robinson. So, you know, Major Taylor wrote this wonderful line in his book. He said, in a word, I was a pioneer and I had to blaze my own trail. And if you go to Chicago, there is a Major Taylor Trail where that quote is on it, so it has a wonderful double meaning. Jack Johnson actually started out being inspired by Major Taylor. It's a little-known story. Jack Johnson was a cyclist. And one day, Jack Johnson, he wanted to be like Major Taylor, become a champion. And one day, Jack Johnson was competing in Texas. And this was a very dangerous sport. Major Taylor wrote that about a dozen of his competitors were killed in various accidents on the track. Many more were seriously injured. And Jack Johnson, riding around the track in Texas one day, was so seriously injured he had to go to the hospital where he was for many days. And it was at that point, Jack Johnson later said, that he decided he wanted to get into a less dangerous sport, boxing. So yes, I do believe that if Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson could talk to us today, that they would say that they were well aware of Major Taylor. Because like I say, he was so chronicled, it's he sort of disappeared from history. Why is that? People always ask me that. Well, there's no audio that we know of, no film we know of, but there are these incredible photos, especially when he raced in France, which is a great part of the book. And there was this new dawn of sports photojournalism, if you will. There had been photos earlier, obviously, in the Civil War, but there was a new type of photography that enabled them to capture racing. And in the cover of the book, we're able to use some racing photo. This was actually from Australia, I think. They were able to capture him, and the photos of him, some of which you saw on the slideshow, really are incredible. You get a sense of him from that. You get a sense of it because he also talks so much to reporters. The press, by and large, outside of the South, and certainly in Europe, was very supportive. They loved him as a story. So you can sort of hear the way he talks and visualize him, even though there's no film and audio. But because there's not, and because bicycle racing faded, we don't know as much about him today, and hopefully the book does its part to bring him back.
You mentioned that he was a celebrity in France.
Yes.
And I'm curious, which country was the most popular cycling done in? Was it France or America?
Well, at a certain point, Major Taylor, was harder and harder to compete in America like he wanted to. A lot of people simply would show up, but he was able to race some of the competitors, like Eddie Ball would say, I'm not going to race Major Taylor, and he just wouldn't show up, and that was very frustrating. There were great racers in Europe for 2 years. A promoter in France would come over to Worcester and come to Major Taylor's home and beg him to race in France. This promoter later said, there was no one else in America I would give a penny for, but I want Major Taylor. That's the man I want to race against, the best racer in France. Major Taylor said, I'll do it, but I won't race on Sundays. He promised his mother for religious reasons that he wouldn't race on Sundays. And the promoter said, that's when we have our big races, you have to. After 2 years, the promoter finally wanted Major Taylor so badly, he gave in and said, okay, we'll pay you, you don't have to race on Sundays if you come over, and Major Taylor agreed. And that was a whole new sensation that occurred. He competed against the champion of France. There was a picture in there of him competing against Edmond Jacquelin, who was the great champion of France. And when that happened, it was one of the greatest crowds that I'd ever seen a cycling event in France, which was sort of the center of cycling in the world then as it is today in many ways. So in the first race against Jacquelin, Major Taylor lost. And so a lot of the French press said, okay, now we know who the great racer is. But when Jacquelin won that race, he gave a mock salute to Major Taylor, and then he held his nose. And Major Taylor was so offended by that he demanded a rematch. He said, I'd never been so insulted in my life. After all I've been through in America, I'd never been so insulted in my life. He demanded a rematch, and he was given one. And in the rematch against Edmond Jacquelin, he beat him. He beat him badly. And at that point, the demand, Take a great seat. The demand for Major Taylor to compete all over Europe, skyrocketed. He competed all over Europe, and then he spent 2 seasons competing in Australia, which I also write about, where he also became a sensation. So it is extraordinary to think about how many Americans, much less Black Americans, did all of that, became heralded all over Europe and all over Australia. There's really very few you can compare him to. That's why he's such a great historical figure. Even if you have zero interest in cycling or cycling history, my hope is that the story is spread to people who want to know about social history, racial history, to really understand, because what he endured, even with all of his benefits, gives you an insight into life at that time in a way that I thought was unparalleled.
Hi. I got the Audible version. I haven't started it yet, but I guess you can't sign that. Did you read it?
I did not read it. They hired a gentleman who did a wonderful job of reading. He was a professional reader. I tend to lose my voice after I talk like this. That's probably as far as I can go. But I've had a number of books and I've had people read them. This gentleman did a great job. So whenever you listen to it, I think you'll agree.
My question is maybe a little bit geeky, but what about the equipment that he had? Can you talk about the tires? And I saw he had no socks on and very, like nothing, shoes. It looks like he had Lycra on, but I'm sure that hadn't been invented yet. And a leather seat, I would imagine, and there was no tape on his handlebars or anything.
Well, this is an important question. Major Taylor not only thought it was important to have the best nutrition, the ideal weight, but he had the great benefit, as I mentioned, of having bicycles made by Bertie Munger, and later other companies made him their sponsor. They put him on the cover of advertisements. I don't know of any other Black American at the time who was basically the image of this great corporation. So he was that popular, and the companies thought he was that important. So they would give him also bicycles. So he had the benefit of the best technology of the day. Bertie Munger gave him a bicycle, for the records of the time, that weighed 14 pounds. And I was so surprised that you could have a 14-pound bicycle in the 1890s that I contacted the foremost bicycle historian in the country. And I sent him this information. I say, here's the information, here's what was said. Does this make sense? Could this be correct? And the person said yes, because it was a completely stripped down track bicycle that was built for that purpose. So it was very, very light, single speed for this particular bicycle. So Major Taylor himself modified this time and again. He built a certain kind of set of handlebars that enabled him to get flatter on his position, so he could modify this himself. So he was very aware technically. There's a wonderful anecdote that he told where he heard a trainer talking to a competing cyclist about how that cyclist could easily beat Major Taylor because Major Taylor didn't understand technique, which was of course not true. And Major Taylor sort of smiled to himself because while he was listening, he studied his competitor's bicycle. He looked, if you're a geek on this, you'll understand what I'm talking about. He looked at the gearing, the size of the teeth and everything else on the bicycle. And basically the question was his competitor going to try to go heavy and try to make it in a tougher gear, if you will, a tougher ring, or was he going to try to spin at an incredibly fast cadence? Major Taylor wasn't the biggest guy. He was 5'7", 150 or so. He relied on a very high cadence to go. But if he saw a competitor who was equally trying to do that, he might modify. And so he would make mental notes to himself of the type of, the size of the ring, the gearing if it was more than a single track and so forth. He was very aware of that and would use that as part of his knowledge. I think I'm getting a signal that...
Unfortunately, we have to stop here.
Can I take one last question?
Okay, thank you
one
so
last
much.
question.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for such an informative presentation on your book.
Thank you.
I can't wait to buy it and get it autographed. You said that the top cyclist of the day at that time were making $10,000. Was he able to make that amount of money and support his family eventually?
He did. I mean, he bought a beautiful house in Worcester. The native people in that area tried to stop him when they found out that a black man was purchasing a new house in the neighborhood. But he was able to do that because there was a lot of publicity about how bad that was. He did make more than $10,000 a year himself. He was one of the top earning cyclists of the era. He could have earned hundreds of thousands of dollars more had he raced on Sundays. In the end, that came back to hurt him. But I tell the story in the book how he used a lot of his winnings to invest in businesses that didn't turn out so great. I tell that story in the book. But he was one of the wealthiest black Americans in blacks in Massachusetts at the time because he was so successful in what he was able to do. And he gave a lot of that money away to his church, family, and so forth. But the story of Major Taylor really is his story of if you are given an equal chance, if you're given an equal shot in society, that you can succeed in any field of human endeavor. Thank you so much for coming out today.
That was really wonderful, and we all have to agitate to have this book made into a movie. And please don't forget to stop by the main book sale tent where you can meet the authors and buy books.
Morristown.